Okay, here we are once again in Cinema 4D R21, and we're going to begin creating our scene for our Daredevil look development. And just to recap sort of what we're going to build, this is a scene that I created that's referencing the look that's used by Elastic in the Daredevil title sequence that was art directed by Patrick Clare. And I just think it's a really cool aesthetic, and I've had people in the past ask me how to do this, so I thought it'd be nice to create a class that teaches people how to create things like this. And so let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing we need is a model to work with. I don't have a Daredevil model, so I'm just going to use some of the built-in models from Cinema 4D. So I'm going to go into the content browser, and I'm going to navigate through the presets. So hopefully you've downloaded these. If you don't have them downloaded, you can download them in your installation of Cinema 4D. So if you open up the 3D Objects volume and go down to Humans, there is a section that says 3D People Medium Resolution. I'm going to use one of these. Which one did I use? I believe I used this guy, but we could use anybody. I think what we're going to do now, I'm actually going to use this one. I think he'll work pretty well. So all you need to do is double click on this and it'll load it into your scene. So this guy is looking down at his phone, and now I'm going to go back to my objects panel so that I can see my original scene. And what I'm going to do is pretty simple. I'm going to remove the material from this model, and I'm going to create my own material. So let's go ahead and just delete the material here, and we'll go into this material tag and go ahead and delete that as well. And when we do that, you can see the geometry that is created for this model. And it's a little bit low poly, so what I might want to do is actually increase that a little bit by throwing this object in a subdivision surface container. So we'll go ahead and throw that in there by holding down Option and clicking on it, or Alt and clicking on it. And now it's being subdivided. It looks a little cleaner. And what I'm looking for is, I dig this sort of back view, and maybe we can get some nice lighting that sort of mimics what's happening in the Daredevil title sequence. And while we're out here, why don't we just go ahead and pull up the Daredevil title sequence. And scrub. I'm just going to go to the Art of the Titles webpage, and they have, if you haven't gone to Art of the Title, it's a great place to just go and check out some scenes. So on here you can actually see some of the thumbnails from the final piece, and they actually walk through their entire creative process. So it's a really nice way to come out and sort of find out how, professional studios are making things. And so if you notice, they're using some 3D models, and so I like to learn from the masters when I can. And so I've got a model that's sort of like that, and we'll use that as our base. So let's go ahead and create the material that you see in our video. So we've got the sort of metallic sort of material that we're going to use. And to create that, I'm going to use a PBR material. So PBR materials are physically based render materials. So they try to mimic the real world. And they basically use the reflectance tab to do all of their work. So I'm just going to open up reflectance, and I'll go ahead and give it a color, and we're going to go for red, but kind of a more subdued sort of red. So darker, maybe a little less saturated red. And on top of that, I think I'm going to add a Beckman. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete the default reflection, and I'm going to add my own Beckman reflection. So off the bat, it just shows up as very, very reflective. But you'll notice here I can change the way this layer works, so I can change it to add. And now that is going to add the reflection to the one below it. So instead of it being a separate layer with opacities and things like that, it's using a mathematical operation to add it in there. Actually, I believe I'm going to delete this default diffuse. I'm just going to start with my own Beckman, and I'll put that back to normal. and I'll make a new one, and this one will be the add layer. So let's hide this top one. The bottom one I'm going to go ahead and change the color similar to what I did before. And so now we've got this deep red color that I like. It seems to be working really well. We can play around with the specular strength on that bottom one, maybe turn up the roughness so it feels a little metallic underneath there. And on the top one that we just created, we're going to go ahead and just turn down the reflection strength on that one quite a bit. And I'm going to add a lot of roughness for the color. Instead of a color, I'm going to put in a noise. And so let's just go ahead and add a noise layer. I'm just trying to build something up that feels a little bit like car paint or something that has some nice texture and layers to it. So I'm selecting blistered turbulence right now, and I'm going to go ahead and change this down, make the scale a little smaller, maybe 20% so it's more grainy. And we'll go up one level now. So we've got our base layer at the bottom. And we'll call this color base. So if you just double click on these, you can change the names of them. We'll call this metallic. And I'm going to do one more, and that's going to also be a Beckman, and this one's also going to be set to add. It's going to have a little bit of roughness, but I'm going to turn down the reflection strength all the way. I'm going to turn down the specular strength to just a little bit. And roughness I'll kick up a little bit. So this is going to give us our bright reflections. This is going to be giving us our metallic color layer underneath. I might actually change the color of that one a little bit too and give it a little bit more red inside there. That'll make it feel a little deeper. And I'm just looking at this and going back and forth and making some changes. So roughness, some noise, some overlay. That looks pretty good to start with. We can always come back and manipulate it a little bit more. And so now when I drag this onto my character, that metallic sort of look is going to be applied to him. And if I render this right now, you'll see I'm not getting a lot because I don't have any lights in my scene, and it's using the default light, and it's blowing it out quite a bit. So let's talk about lights. I think the next thing we're going to do is set up some lighting for this scene. And if we look in the video that I created for you guys, it looks like there's this fuzzy halo sort of light coming down, and that is a visible light. So Cinema 4D allows you to create different types of lights. So visible light is something that actually is visible, and you can apply noise to it and make some really interesting effects with it. And so let's go ahead and just create a light. I think I will create just a standard light. We're going to zoom out of our scene a little bit and just drag this light up right above this guy's head. And I'm going to move it a little so it's a little bit behind him as well. And so in your scene, maybe you want to replace this object with, instead of a person, it could be a building structure or something like that, or something unique to your individual scene. But I'm looking at these reflections and I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this really going to look like for me in my scene? I kind of like the way this is glinting off of his shoulder. Maybe we want to rotate around this way. I think I like this view better. And so as I'm rotating around here and getting the sort of reflections that I want in my scene, I'm actually going to go ahead and set up a camera view. So while I'm rotating around and starting to frame things a little bit, I'm going to set up our initial camera view. And I'll go ahead and add a camera in place right now, and then we'll look through that camera. And I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that camera on the first frame. So what that does is it locks the camera in place. So now if I were to be looking through the camera as I am and then rotate my scene and move in my timeline, it's going to snap back because I've keyframed that. Now, one of the things I like to do at this point is to start setting something up so I can begin doing test renders without getting into too much trouble and feeling like I'm getting lost. And so I'm going to go ahead and set that up right now. I'm going to create a new view panel, and I'm going to drag that view panel down here. And then I'm going to create another new view panel. And I'm going to drag that view panel right on top of this one. So you'll notice it snaps right up there. And then what I'll do is use this top view for all of my preview renders so that I can get an idea for what this is actually looking like in my piece. And so I need to set this camera up to use my camera that I've created in my scene. So these match. But what's nice about this feature is if I unclick my camera now, this one is no longer looking through it, this one is not looking through it, but this one still is. And so I can always do a preview render by hitting Command R and see what I'm actually getting in my scene right now, which isn't much. Let's see what happens if we add some changes to our light here. So let's go ahead and just add some visibility. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on interactive region render. So interactive region render is a way to see what's being rendered all the time. So this is great if you don't have a great graphics card in your machine and you want to use the standard renderer, which is what I'm going to use for this project. You can use the interactive region render and get something that sort of mimics a real-time renderer. So if I were to rotate my scene right now, this is going to update and it's going to give me new render based on where I'm at the time. So it's really handy. Let's get our light and go ahead and turn on some visibility. So if we're in the general setting for our light and we come in, we can say light type. We're going to use visible. And you can see right off the bat that's going to give us this foggy sort of appearance, and we've got a fall off control that we can move in. If we go into our visibility tab now, we can see that the outer distance is set to 500 centimeters. Now that number might be different for you, or it might mean something totally different for you depending on the scale of your scene. But for the purposes of this, I know that I don't want it to be very big, right? I want it to just be sort of a glowing spot. And so hopefully you're starting to see that that is that glowing sort of halo that we're going to have coming down. And you can set up the inner visibility distance and the outer visibility distance. So you have an inner ring that you can change, and that'll make it brighter in the center or darker in the center. Right now this light is set up to both highlight or light shine on my object as well as create this visibility. Sometimes I like to create a light that is just visible, and sometimes I like to create a light that is just illuminating my scene. And it really depends on sort of what I'm going for and how much control I want to be able to change for each individual light, or how much I want to be able to change the settings for each individual light. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this guy, and I'm going to call him visible light. And I'm going to Command C and Command V and duplicate them. And this one is just going to be called illumination, and you call it whatever you want to call it. In this light I'm going to go to general and I'm going to say visible none. In this light I'm going to go to the general settings and I'm going to uncheck. I'm going to check this button that says no illumination. And so now you'll see if I turn off the visible light by unchecking it, I'm still getting illumination. If I keep the visible light on and check off illumination, my highlights change because now my scene is switched to my default light and turned this light off. And so it's a nice, powerful way to get a look and be able to also manipulate a few more things. So for example, I could now say, you know what, I want the illumination highlights just to be a little bit more forward than they are, but my visible light's not going to be changing if I do that right now. So that can be a really nice thing to be able to work with. Let's go ahead and work on the color for this light. I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit of a red color, maybe a subdued sort of red. I'm looking at the visible light. And so now we're bringing that redness into our scene. It's a little vibrant right now. I think I could turn that down a little bit more. So I'm turning down saturation and turning up the brightness, or the value, just to make it a little more pink, a little less red. Just going to keep playing with that until I feel happy with it. I'm also going to come into my noise area for this light, and I'm going to turn on noise. I'm going to do that for, well, because this light is only visible, I'm just going to do it in visibility. Now the noise feature in here is really nice. We can do a standard noise, we can do a soft turbulence, we can do hard turbulence, wavy turbulence. So whatever you want to do for yours is fine. I'm trying to, create a certain look, and right now I can see that things feel a little dark. They feel the noise isn't really coming through, and so to get that to come through better, I want to come in here and change my scale. And so I'm just going to go ahead and change it all down to about 20%. And now you can see that noise being generated in the scene. And you can see that if I move through my playhead and pause a little bit, that noise is moving. So that noise is being controlled by the velocity. It's at 25%. And it's also being controlled by this wind, which is at 1 centimeter right now, in the X direction. And I'm going to change that from the X direction to the Y direction. I'm going to go ahead and change my velocity down to about 5%. And then I'm going to go through and just go through a few frames and see where we're at, see what kind of movement I'm getting, if I'm happy with it. Doesn't look like I'm getting very much movement at all. Let's try turning our velocity up to 15%. So it always takes a little bit of playing and manipulating. So I'm seeing some motion happening in there now. And that's probably enough. I don't want it to be too drastic. I just want it to be a subtle sort of background motion that's happening. And let's go ahead and work on our illumination now. So this light currently is illuminating infinitely, and I don't want it to do that. I want it to be really bright right here and then fall off as soon as it gets down to the bottom of this guy's shirt, or right to the bottom of the frame, so we have this nice dark halo that's happening around the bottom. And so to do that, I'm going to turn on a fall off. So I'm going into my light object settings, going to details, and I'm going to say fall off, inverse square physically accurate. And what's that going to do? It's going to give us a similar fall off radius that we saw in the visibility of our other light, right? So we've got an outer distance, and this one we have fall off radius, and I can change that dimension. So the more I change this down, the less it's going to be illuminating my character and my scene. And it's going to be really hot or bright the closer it is to my person. So if I drag this light down by his head, you'll see that it's brighter here, and it shows us that in the scene as well. And so it just takes some manipulating of this light to get it to be where you want it to go. And so I'm starting to like what I'm seeing here. I'm getting really bright light that's happening. Let's snap back to our camera view. And what I'm not liking right now is the way it's kind of hitting this guy's top of his head. I think I might actually move that light forward a tiny bit, so that it's more of a rim light. And based on what I'm seeing here, I'm going to make a decision to go ahead and change the type of light that I'm using. So right now this is a single omni light. I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it to an area light. And why am I doing that? I'm doing that because I want to have a little more control. So I'm just going to rotate this light around. It still has the same fall off settings, but now I can create a long, wide light. Probably don't want it to be as long as that. But you notice what's happening with that light now is it's spreading across the top of this gentleman's head, is that I'm getting something that feels more like a nice rim light, and it's giving me the kinds of highlights that I'm looking for. And so it's really important to sort of understand how these lights function and how you can manipulate them to your advantage in your scene. So I'm looking at this, I'm trying to evaluate what else do I need to do to get this look to be the way I want. And I feel like if I go back to my QuickTime movie that I created earlier, that I apparently closed, you can see that it's very bright in the center and it's falling off. And I'm getting a nice silhouette on this guy's face, on the back of his neck. And I want to be able to create that similar look. Now, I will say we're not going to be able to get all of that in Cinema 4D directly. We're going to actually take some of this into After Effects and do some post work on it. But right now I'm going to do just one more visible light, and this will be our base sort of setting for our scene, and you can see how that's already brightened it up incredibly. And this visible light I'm going to change to be just a little bit more on the pinky side. It's just slightly. And I'm also going to change the size of it, of the visibility. So let's change it down. In the center, we'll make it a little smaller. And in the outer part, we'll make it a little smaller. And I'm actually going to move it down so that it's closer to him. And so what this is going to do is create that sort of visible halo that's right above his head, and it's going to light things up. And what I'm also going to do with this visible light, we'll relabel this one and call it smaller, bright, visible. I'm going to actually turn illumination back on for this one. And so let's go ahead and let it illuminate. It's going to add a couple more highlights in there, and that's okay. You know what? I think I'm changing my mind. I'm going to go ahead and leave it off. I don't like the way those highlights looked, but I do like the way the light was looking. I'm going to pump this up to 120%. Okay, 150. So it's all about sort of playing and manipulating things to try to get the look that you want. So that's the basic level of just how to get things set up and sort of get the look development going. In the next segment for the class, I'm going to talk about how to set up some of the particle simulations so we get these reflective little glints and highlights that are happening. So play through this again. You see these little floaties that are happening and moving around, and that is a Mograph feature. And then later on in the class, we're going to actually render this out and move our camera, set our camera movement up, render it out, and then we'll go into After Effects and do some post work so we can get it to look just like we want to.